Welcome to the Gus Alva Perspective video cast that's earmarked to look at the difference between a mindset of gratitude um, and abundance as opposed to the mindset of fear and scarcity and the paralyzing effects that that particular mindset might have, and the fact that we can do a whole heck of a lot about changing our perspective completely. The topic that I'd like to deal with today is an interesting one. Being a medical professional, but also being a human being, has taught me a lot of different things over the course of time. The differences between discipline and being disciplined is what I'd like to touch on. And the underlying theme here is that actions generally carry consequences. There's really an interesting quote that I'd like to share with you. The quote goes along the lines of hard times creating strong men creating good times creating weak men, and weak men creating hard times. This is an interesting quote by an author, Michael Hoff. I think I would have liked to have actually thought of this particular quote myself, but I didn't. And obviously, I need to, again, credit the individual that came up with the concept. But it's a really interesting one because, as I take a look back at the overall formation of who we become, it's an interesting setting. I grew up in a different time than what we're living at the present time. I remember as a child driving around with my family. My family owned a station wagon, and the interesting thing was rolling around in the back of the station wagon, no seatbelt on, obviously, and then subsequently jumping back and forth across the car, and not necessarily thinking much about that. Obviously, not negating the fact that seatbelts are very important later on in life. I remember being driven to my high school by my mom, and a car just ripping through the street and literally T-boning us as we were going through an intersection. Fortunately, at that particular point in time, we had gotten rid of the station wagon, and now we had a GMC Jimmy, a very big truck. But I remember sitting in the passenger seat and being T-boned by a Mustang, coming in at high velocity, and the entire car being dented in. I probably would have died had not uh, the overall structure of the car just been as powerful as it was, and me being strapped in a seatbelt. Obviously, I clearly must have saved my life. It shook up my mom, shook me up also. But it made me think of, again, the differences along the lines of where we've been and where we are right now. I'll tell you, there's some interesting thoughts back also. Jumping from elementary over to junior high school, and immediately at that point being welcomed by a very interesting notion. The school where I went to had these long stairwells, and with the stairwells, obviously there was an opportunity of sliding down the stairwell. Well, the stairs obviously meant that there were like 3 floors of space. So as you came sliding down the stairwell, you could potentially fall and injure yourself quite badly. And I'm talking about a public school. I attended public schools here in the Orange County area in California locally. But I recall, hopping off the stairwell and being met by the vice president. I still remember his name, Mr. Primus, and him saying, "Come here, I need you to come over to my office." And what was waiting for me was a big waffle paddle with holes drilled in it, and him asking, "Well, how many swats do you want?" And I remember thinking, what? What do you mean, how many swats do I want? And of course, him immediately saying, "Well, you're getting at least 3," and him taking some serious swipes at my tush, and feeling the sting of that and thinking, "Oh my God, this is so painful. I don't ever want to do this again." And then him calling my parents and me overhearing my mother saying, "Well, why don't you give him another 2 more while you're at it right now so as to teach him a lesson?" And I recall there was a certain degree of cruelty, but there was also a certain degree of wanting to make sure that I figured out that there were certain types of behaviors that might lead me down a particular path of problems. And at that point, I guess I had a choice of rebelling or simply acknowledging that, we sometimes err, we sometimes goof up, we sometimes need those boundaries to keep us in place. But the interesting thing was the differences and the changes that I subsequently saw occurring. At that point, there was a great degree of respect that was owed, uh, not only the educators that were overseeing my education, but certainly knowing that my parents held me responsible for my actions also, and knew that, the people that were there to help me and protect me and help guide me down an appropriate path. It's an interesting situation because I've certainly seen that change. And, I've seen it change in many ways where people now oftentimes, think that there are different types of things, different actions that are so over the top when in reality they're being earmarked to keep people in check and keep them from getting into serious trouble. But they're construed in a manner in which all of a sudden they are, thrown overboard and made to seem, almost criminalistic in nature. I'm not necessarily saying and advocating for, the whole situation associated with corporal punishment. Everybody obviously sires their children the way they feel like they should, and obviously, there may be better patterns along the lines of keeping people within certain boundaries. But now things have changed dramatically to the point where, you oftentimes will hear children state to their parents, and I hear this when all of a sudden I'm doing a consult with a family, and the child actually threatening to call the police on their parents over some mundane issue. And then subsequently, the parents saying, well, do me a favor, go ahead and call the police right now, just to see what subsequently ensues out of this. And, you know, when we take a look at some of the patterns of what happened when people aren't necessarily held accountable for the things that they do, that becomes an important point. So, discipline, in the case of what I was describing, I certainly got disciplined over time, but discipline also in understanding that there are certain safeguards and different rails that are set for us to help us out, but also being disciplined are two very different things. And the reality is that there's always a consequence to the different actions that we set into. I guess I'm stating all of these things because these are themes that oftentimes pop out when I'm having a session with a patient, and particularly so when there are families that are involved. And, lacking that self discipline and lacking that ability to be able to stay within the boundaries that should actually be there for us, oftentimes eh, call out people for getting into trouble and aggravating the different circumstances that they find themselves in. you know, it's interesting because that calls to question the whole situation around parenting and the fact that it's gotten quite difficult to make sure that, parents are doing the right things. Anybody can sire a child, but certainly it takes a great degree of discipline to be a truly good parent. And we oftentimes see the consequence of, the difference between a good parent and a bad one. We talk about early life adversity with different neuropsychiatric conditions, and the fact that you can change um, almost the very nature of genetics in someone, what we call epigenetics. In other words, things or circumstances that are revolving around an individual at a very early point in life can almost change the very nature of, different things that are experienced by people from a neuropsychiatric perspective. And so, this whole concept of discipline and being disciplined really are themes that go hand in hand. But our mindset of gratitude and abundance should definitely be taken into context with this notion. Why? Because if we err, it's important to recognize that we've erred and to utilize that as an example, not to look at it as a failure and, create a situation whereby now we have an excuse to no longer venture out and try to do more, or try to be adventuresome, or try to get ahead, or try to accomplish more. And in fact, being disciplined helps along the lines of maintaining that sense of purpose, maintaining that trajectory, and allowing us the opportunity to move beyond areas that may have been deficient. So coming back to my examples, receiving SWATs, certainly taught me the fact that, geez, had I fallen off of that, stairwell, I could have potentially died. Uh, I guess it's an interesting thing. I'm sort of a cat with nine lives, because as I look back, there's multiple examples where, not being appropriately disciplined might have actually led towards a bad outcome for me. But the beauty about having an appropriate formation, a good family structure, good guidance from good parents, and a good community upon which to rely on have certainly helped along lines of keeping me going steady, moving forward, and now contributing in a mighty manner within the community in which I serve. So, an interesting point. We live in a time right now where we have to take into consideration discipline and being disciplined, and maintain that sense of gratitude in our hearts so as to be able to actually get ahead. Thank you for joining us in the Gus Alva perspective, an interesting uh, traversing through childhood memories and how they apply even now.